So, we are going to start a conversation that is ultimately going to take us through continued U.S. expansion all the way out to the Pacific. And then we are also going to be talking about sectionalism, this crisis that comes about when how you have to decide, how do you add states? Are they free states? Are they slave states? Are they going to be allowed to have slavery, but that slavery ends within a designated amount of time? And we are continuing to stave off um, what some people have called the inevitable, but of course, nothing in history is inevitable, and that is the Civil War. So we are going to compromise and compromise and compromise and compromise. We'll be talking about the Compromise of 1850 and Henry Clay. We'll be talking about the conflicts in Texas and with Mexico, and we'll be talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, how Jefferson Davis feels about railroad expansion. So all of these things are going to combine to inform our lead up, our really immediate build up to the Civil War. But we're going to start with this idea of manifest destiny and this idea of expansion. So, our sort of big guiding question is, how did popular enthusiasm for U.S. expansion lead to debates over slavery, culminating in the secession of Southern states? And I'm going to turn this into some SAQ practice in a few days. So keep that question sort of at the top of your mind. And then in terms of what we're looking at here when it comes to the AP concepts, we're talking about popular enthusiasm for U.S. expansion, bolstered by economic and security interest, resulted in acquisition of new territories, substantial migration westward, and new overseas initiatives. And then also debates over slavery come to dominate the political discussion of the 1850s, culminating in the bitter election of 1860 and the secession of Southern states. So we want to look at each of these ideas independently and think about them independently, but then we also need to make sure that we are understanding causation here when it comes to the Civil War. And we're understanding the consequences of expansion and everything that comes around with it. And again, this idea of historical context and contextualization, that nothing in history happens in a vacuum. So this image is very important. There's a little bit of a small separate assignment on this image. This is by John Gast. It's called American Progress from 1872. And you may have not seen this image before, although it is in your textbook. You may have not seen this picture before, but you have probably at least seen this figure here, this idea of manifest destiny that she embodies. She is the embodiment of this idea of American progress, and she is moving westward. And even notice she's carrying with her some cable wire here in her hand as she goes. So we're going to be doing some work in this folder, actually, that will unpack some of the important symbols in this picture, in this image. But this is something that we should keep in mind, that American progress is moving westward. You can see what is sort of fleeing and moving away from American progress and what is following American progress as she travels. So we will be taking some time to unpack this image further, but this should sort of pop into our mind when we think about manifest destiny. And also, when we talk about document-based questions, images are documents. So you could get a document-based question that had this as one of your documents. Okay, so can you define manifest destiny? Take just a second. Can you define it? Generally speaking, manifest destiny is this idea that the United States of America is destined to extend its borders. It's destined to expand from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, that we are expanding liberty. A lot of this is a consequence of this growing American pride and this growing idea of American nationalism. Remember, like when we talked about the War of 1812, our pride in our country is at a high there, and we believe that we should expand. That this idea of what social perfectionism is it life in a crowded city Or is it, stretching out and having space to roam? What is the idea of an American frontier do for people? That I can go west and I can seek my fortune, that I can be a self made individual, that I can pull myself up by my bootstraps, that there's always opportunity waiting in the frontier. And that is a lot of what's driving this westward movement. It's also, has religious implications, manifest destiny. It's not just that America is strong and so America should expand. That's one part of it. But it's also this idea that God has ordained this, has blessed the United States, and has deemed that the United States should spread liberty and freedom from coast to coast. Um, Proponents of manifest destiny call it an empire of liberty, which is a really interesting phrase, right? An empire of liberty. And that empire, they believe, should include Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Pacific Islands. Now, of course, we know that the United States does not take over Canada, right? That the United States does not take over the entire Caribbean or all the Pacific Islands or all of Mexico. But we are going to be eating into that territory. And we'll be talking about that both in this unit and later units as well. And those who are, and by the way, this idea is being spread by the penny press. And remember, the penny press are these very inexpensive newspapers or pamphlets that are being published that a lot of times are full of propaganda that people buy. We'll be talking about yellow journalism, these individuals who are sort of pushing an agenda. Now, if you are against manifest destiny, you're against it for a few reasons, but one of the most important ones is slavery, the slavery controversy. Remember Henry Clay? He's known as the great compromiser, right? He's always writing these compromises to stave off civil war, what will ultimately become the Civil War, to stave off conflict. And so he sees this idea of manifest destiny. He's like, come on, how many compromises do I have to make between you guys? At what point can we just be satisfied with our borders and have the status quo? Because every time you add more territory, you reopen that conversation regarding slavery and whether or not it should be legal in newly admitted states. And this map, although it's a little bit blurry, you can see where we in the United States, where we have added territory. So we see the pale yellow is going to be the United States in 1783. And then you sort of look south and you can see, or west, let's start west. You've got the green, that little territory near North Dakota, ceded by Britain in the early 1800s. Before that, even, you have the Louisiana Purchase. Down south, you've got some territory ceded by Spain and annexed by Spain, 1810, 1812. That Adams-Onis Treaty, which gives us Spanish Florida, 1819, 1821. And then up north in 1842, you have the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which we've talked about, giving us portions, the dark green portions of Maine and Minnesota. We also have some territory in Oregon country, and then this Mexican cession and Texas annexation, along with the Gadsden Purchase, is going to be a lot of what we focus on in this unit. So this is all the territory growth of the United States through 1853. And so you can see all of the conversations about the legality of slavery that are going to come along with this and how quickly we grow our country. If you're thinking about presidents, the president that we most associate with manifest destiny is James K. Polk. He is going to add a lot of this. But of course, he's not the only one. We've talked about Monroe being an important president of manifest destiny. So lots of individuals contributing to this here. So I'm going to pause our conversation here. We'll pick it up again when we talk about Texas. And I also want us to unpack that image a little bit more. Thank you.